Hi, welcome to the Bell Ringer's very first video interview with an expert. I'm journalist Holly Corby, and I'm really excited to have Dr. Nathaniel Swain here today. He's an instructional coach and researcher and author of the book Harnessing the Science of Learning. He's a senior lecturer of learning sciences and learning engagement at La Trobe University's School of Education, located in Melbourne, Australia, which is where he's at today. Welcome, Nathaniel.
Thank you, Holly. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
I'm so excited about this conversation. So the reason Nathaniel's here today is we're going to talk about how teachers present material to students, how they teach. And so he's here to help clarify a few things for us using his expertise. So over the last few weeks, I've been doing some Bell Ringer reporting on the two types of teaching, explicit instruction and inquiry instruction. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago called The Disagreement, and in this episode called The Math Wars, I argued the case for teachers using explicit instruction. And I argued with the president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, Kevin Dykema, and Kevin was arguing for inquiry-based learning. So since that podcast launched, I've gotten more than a few requests from readers to clarify exactly what do we mean when we say explicit instruction or inquiry instruction, and how can people outside the world of education tell which is which, and why does it matter? So I asked you on today hoping that you can give us a few answers and a few clues and maybe point us towards some research. So does that sound good?
Sounds amazing. Really excited.
Good. All right. So let's start with question number one. Let's start with the why. Why should we, the general public, care about teaching methods and which teaching methods teachers use in classrooms? Why is knowing the difference between inquiry and explicit important to people outside the world of education, like parents?
Of course, yeah. So the main reason is because what we do in the classroom and what the teacher chooses to do with their time and their students' time really matters for equity and it matters for excellence. So the decisions that we make as teachers, and in my own classroom this is no different, we have to be really cognizant that every decision that we make has consequences. So if we choose approaches that are very effective and that allow all of our students to achieve, then we can achieve equity and excellence. If we choose approaches that are less effective, that seem nice but potentially don't lead to as good outcomes, we actually left with outcomes that are poorer for our students or that are poorer in general for our practice, might make our teaching harder, might make it a less enjoyable experience for everyone. So what the teacher chooses to do is really important.
Okay, so that's great. So just to clarify, the way that teachers talk to students, the kinds of tasks they have students do really matter in how much the students end up learning.
Oh, incredibly. And I think the research that's been accumulated over the last 50 years shows that it's one of the biggest factors that we have control over.
Okay.
So we can't control for the home environment, we can't control for family background and different experiences outside the school, we can't control for all kinds of things, how much homework they do and so on and so forth. But what the teacher does in the classroom, how they teach and how they respond to their students in real time, is one of the biggest levers that we can pull.
Okay, great. So let's get into the two kinds then. Let's start with inquiry-based instruction. And can you just explain what it is? And I know that it goes by several different names. So could you just also include the different names and what's the reasoning behind it?
Sure. So there's lots of different terms that refer to arguably slightly different things, but things that are tied together around a particular theme. So if you wanted to call it one thing, you could call it inquiry approaches or inquiry approaches to mathematics. But in all honesty, these terminologies really defy definition. So a lot of them are used interchangeably. There's guided inquiry, there's structured inquiry, there's inquiry plus. There's building thinking classrooms, there's deep thinking, critical thinking, there's applied maths or mathematics, there's math in real life. There's all kinds of different terminology for what essentially is an approach to teaching of mathematics that puts the learner and what they are wanting to learn about potentially, and also a more fun and more approachable sort of view of mathematics than most people are used to at the front and center. So rather than the teacher explaining things directly, potentially they do a lot of tasks which are meant to be fun and engaging and might be open-ended and don't have a right or a wrong answer. The theory is sort of built upon the idea that students don't really like math, and it's really it's important that we try and remove those myths and fears about it. And maths anxiety is spoken about a lot in those contexts. So the idea is to make it more fun, make it less stressful, less about right or wrong answers, more collaborative, and essentially do the cool stuff that mathematicians are supposedly doing, which obviously accomplished mathematicians are doing cool stuff, but it's reliant upon many, many years of study. So it's a little bit of a pretend game to say that we can act like mathematicians when we're just learning the basics and the foundations. But that's sort of a sprinkling, I guess. I don't know if I've missed any there.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a researcher, Dr. Lin Zhang, a few weeks ago, and I actually posted the post in the Bell Ringer. And the way she explained inquiry learning is that the teacher withholds the answer from the students and doesn't show students how to do a math problem. Is that in line with what you think that it is?
I think that's one of the guiding themes,
Okay.
and I think where that instruction is found will differ depending on the approach. So some inquiry approaches to math will put the instruction in the middle, so it'll be explore, and it'll be engage students, and then you sort of explain. Others will not put any instruction in at all. It'll say, well, whatever the student makes from the task is what the learning shall be, and we'll get them to come up with the answer. So there's guidance in some very, very popular approaches in America at the moment where if students ask you a question, you are only to answer in other questions. So what do you think it might be? Or who can you ask to find out this? Or which one of your friends might have found out an answer to this question? So withholding instruction is a strong feature. And it is essentially, it's built upon the theory of constructivism, which is a theory of learning, which bears true with the scientific research, but it's not really a theory of teaching. So if you believe that constructivism is that children need to construct their own understandings and their own knowledge, as in they can't do a carbon copy of what you're saying and put it into their own heads, they do need to form their own understandings and their own schema is what it's called. But it's not a theory of teaching because it doesn't hold true that we need to actually make students struggle, or that we need to withhold instruction from them. In fact, humans are very good at constructing understandings based on the explanations and modelling of other humans. That's essentially how we've been able to pass knowledge on for the past however thousand years. So yeah, one of the features is that because we want students to come to the learning themselves, we actually need to hold the instruction back. And it's actually very counterintuitive to other approaches that we're going to talk about.
Okay, that's great. And so could you also give people a clue? How would they recognize inquiry instruction if they walked into their kid's classroom tomorrow? Let's say they walked into their kid's fifth grade classroom tomorrow. What would it look like? What are the signs of inquiry-based instruction?
So for the majority of the time in the classroom, you'll see the teacher sort of roaming, or you'll see the teacher sort of on the side. You'll see students actively, or hopefully actively, engaged in some sort of activity. It might be some sort of game. They might be learning something through a task or through some sort of application. They might be unpacking a problem that another student is looking at. Like the whiteboards around the room and sort of all looking at a problem is one thing, but the teacher not necessarily being front and center there. You'll also see lots of applied sort of tasks and not a lot of practice of particular skills. You'll see provocations and the teachers providing nudges in different directions, but you won't necessarily see students actually sort of doing things in a more structured and more rigorous way. There won't be necessarily a review of prior learning at the start of the lesson where they're quickly retrieving prior sort of learnings and understanding. So that kind of more teacher-centered instruction is essentially very out of fashion when we talk about inquiry math, and you won't see that, and you'll think, oh, this looks like a different way of teaching to what I've seen before, if you have experienced education that has the teacher at the front and center a bit more.
Okay, and so here in the States, I don't know if they use this in Australia, but here in the States, they say, a lot of times they call it discovery learning or exploratory.
Oh yeah, that's the other one I forgot.
Well, exploratory learning. So
Exactly.
if you walk into a classroom, you're going to see lots of discovering and exploring. In my own
Yes.
kids' classrooms, a lot of times they would all be working in groups. They would all be like 4 or 5 groups around the
Definitely.
class. Yeah.
And essentially, they might be actually doing a project.
Yeah.
So there might be a number of lessons that they're applying their understandings and trying to learn things from doing their independent sort of project. They might be solving an issue using some mathematics, or they might be trying to put something together that they're going to present a little bit later. And the teachers are sort of providing help where possible, but essentially the students are guiding the learning. And There's nothing wrong with using approaches like that in general, but when you're trying to teach the very complex, very hierarchical set of skills and knowledge that is mathematics, there actually probably is not enough instruction at the front end and enough practice in the middle and at the start as well to actually consolidate the understandings that students are going to need. And I think that's just reflected in a lot of your reporting the last few weeks, Holly.
Thank you. And so now, I mean, we're kind of already moving into explicit instruction. So could you talk a little bit about what is explicit instruction? What does it look like? How do people know it when they see it?
Yeah. So I'm going to use Rosenshine's principles, which are 10 very concrete principles that you can refer to that sort of describe some of the key components of explicit instruction. And look, there are many different labels in this field as well. So there's explicit instruction, explicit direct instruction, there's explicit teaching approaches, all these other different kinds of labels. And it's important to know that some of the nuances are still there and there's differences between those approaches. But essentially, Rosenshine's is a pretty safe model that we can use as an example to say what are some of the key components that you might see as a parent if you're looking in a classroom. So you might see students engaging in daily review. So they're actually doing very quick retrieval practice on a task that they come into the classroom and complete, or in a teacher facilitated review session where they're doing problems from the whiteboard or from a PowerPoint presentation and practicing things on the whiteboard, showing their answers and getting very, very quick rapid fire feedback. They might be doing choral responses on things like multiplication facts or addition and subtraction facts, or number bonds sometimes they're called. But in that, after that daily review part, which is very fast-paced and meant to be quite energetic and obviously a lot of fun, it doesn't have to be boring, it can actually be really, really fun. The main thing is that teachers are looking at their instruction really sequentially and really hierarchically. So saying, this is where I want them to be by the end of year 3 or grade 3, what do I need to teach them in order to do that end sort of point? So breaking all of that instruction down into small steps and providing practice for students with all of those small steps. So within the lesson, it's actually saying, well, today we're adding 2-digit numbers. These are all the steps that we're going to follow in order to get there. We're going to start with a simple 2-digit number addition problem, for example. And there's going to be lots of opportunities to see the teacher modeling and the students practicing those small steps. The teacher's also going to ask lots of questions and do something called checking for understanding, where they're going to actually orchestrate opportunities every 3 or 4 minutes to see whether students are getting what the teacher's explaining. This is one of the misconceptions about explicit teaching, in that it's the teacher lecturing and the students just have to sit there and listen. In fact, it should be actively engaged, and there should be lots of opportunities for students to get feedback as the lesson is unfolding. There's a few others here that I'm just going to brush over quickly for brevity, but it's things like providing explicit models. So something called a worked example is really important. So rather than saying, I want you to try these problems and see how you go, actually saying, well, here's a problem that we're going to solve eventually at the end of the lesson, but I'm going to show you how to do this one first. I'm going to show you step by step from the beginning. Then there's a practice called guided practice, where teachers and students are doing little bits of that whole problem back and forth. I'll show you one, you do one, I'll show you one, you do one, and getting feedback along the way. And then as that sort of happens, those scaffolds can sort of be removed a little bit, and you can sort of have students doing a whole problem by themselves that is the culmination of all of that work in a particular lesson. And it may well be the culmination of lots of different lessons on lots of different skills and knowledge that's been accumulating over the course of the year, for example. And then you would see at an explicit instruction level lots of independent practice at the end of the session as well. So there might be at least 20 or 15 or sometimes 30 minutes of practice where students are taking the learning that they've had facilitated by the teacher and being able to apply it by themselves. And that's really important, because that's the whole end point. We're not wanting students to become dependent on us as teachers. We're wanting them to end up being independent learners at the end of it, which is true for both approaches in terms of goals.
Absolutely. And what it sounds like to me is, when you get to it's just like the order is a little different. So the teacher...
The order is different, exactly.
The teacher gives you the answers at the beginning to show you how to do the problems, but then slowly takes away the supports until kids can discover the answers on their own, but only after they've been through these other steps.
Exactly. And if discover is not exactly the right word, it's so that they can find or problem solve the answer on their own. But they're using the methods. Right. They're using the methods that we've actually shown them, because we're not withholding the methodology or the instruction to get there. We're actually trying to make it easy for them to master something that's actually very hard, rather than making it hard for them to retrieve and figure out something that's actually very hard.
That is very clear to me. Thank you for explaining that. So looking at scientific research, and this is something that I brought up, on the Math Wars podcast. So explicit instruction seems to have an edge over inquiry-based instruction when it comes to how much children can learn. So can you just talk a little bit about why that is? What does the research say? Explain the research piece.
Sure. And look, mathematics researchers or mathematic educators that are listening to this podcast or that are accessing this in some way, they will, basically say there is lots of research on mathematics education, and not all of it is pointing in one direction. The important point here is that there's research studies that have a really high level of rigor behind them, that aren't just written case studies or anecdotal notes that have been written up as a reflection, and not a once-off study without proper controls. When you look at the scientific sort of research and the highest quality studies, this is where I guess we get to. And there's 3 or 4 points that I want to run through here of where all these different evidence is coming from, because it isn't just one source of study as well. Just to finish that disclaimer, there is lots of research out there, and there's plenty of research papers talking about the benefits of inquiry learning as well. But the point is that there isn't very, very strong evidence, empirical evidence, that these perform better than, say, more explicit and direct approaches. So where is the evidence for explicit instruction approaches in mathematics? Well, process product research is one of the big fields of study that happened in the 80s and 70s as well. This is where Rosenshine sort of did a lot of his work, where they studied very, very high-performing teachers who had fantastic results and tried to capture what it is that they did. So what do effective teachers do? And that's essentially where Rosenshine's principles came from. Those teachers that had intuited these strategies and these approaches and included those 10 principles of practice, they essentially got much better results. And the theory goes is that because students' understanding was much more facilitated, it was guided, there was an opportunity for them to receive feedback at the right time rather than much too late, and that essentially led to better outcomes. One of the other sources of scientific evidence is something called project follow-through, which I know has been covered in a lot of reporting and a lot of discussion in the blogosphere recently. For parents, this is a really important body of research that actually was sort of buried back in the 80s and 90s when the results started coming out. So this is a really important aspect to then resurface and sort of look at. This is one of the most expensive research programs ever funded in history, and it basically found that compared to lots of different approaches, including inquiry, including approaches focused on conceptual sort of understanding and all that sort of thing, and social emotional sort of learning approaches for teaching of education, direct approaches, so direct instruction, actually outperformed everything and every other approach. And this wasn't just on academic outcomes, it was on the social and emotional outcomes as well. And the theory goes that rather than trying to engage students and get them excited about their learning in order for them to achieve better, we actually need to help them feel successful and help them experience real success, so get better at their learning through better teaching, for that motivation and that sense of efficacy to take over. So there's 2 explanations there, which we basically see that it's much more likely for success to lead to motivation rather than motivation to somehow orchestrate success. The other source is the cognitive science research, particularly cognitive load theory and the emerging evidence from retrieval and spaced practice. So these sort of broad terms essentially show that novices, so students who are new to learning, actually need a lot of expert guidance and a lot of error feedback. And the reason is because students' working memory is easily overloaded by new information, and they need someone to help break it down so that it's manageable. Hence, the Rosenshine's principle is all about small steps, manageable chunks. So cognitive load theory basically says that if we don't take that into account, we get students overloaded, overwhelmed. They can't actually see the things that experts can see when they look at a whole problem and break it all down. They actually need someone to help break down that process, which is where a worked example and scaffolds are really important. The final piece of evidence, I think, comes from general sort of scientific theory that's really strong at the moment from cognitive science, is summed up in Stanislas Dehaene's principles of learning, which I think are really aligning with this as well. And this is the importance of attention. So having students' attention and making sure that they can focus. This is where a noisy, busy environment where students are all working on different projects and making a lot of noise and all doing different things potentially isn't very productive for students' initial learning, because it's actually a very distracting environment to work in. No adults really like working in an open plan office for that particular reason. The second principle is active engagement. So students have to be actively engaged, not just sitting there passively, but actually doing something with the learning. And that is all related to the things that I ran through before that explicit teaching does so well, is that it's lots of opportunities for practice, for feedback, for checking for understanding. The next one is error feedback. So actually getting in time, in the moment sort of feedback on whether you're on the track or not waiting till the end of the project or the end of the independent problem solving session to know if you're on the right track or not. And then finally, consolidation, which is where the review and the practice and the long-term sort of retrieval comes in. Students need to not just do a lesson once or a unit once and then forget about it. They need to constantly go back over and see whether they're remembering. And through that retrieval practice, they're actually testing themselves, and that actually strengthens the learning as well. So all of those sources basically go and give a lot of weight and a lot of support for the importance of explicit instruction. But to be honest, the educational academy, if you like, across maths but other learning areas as well, aren't quite ready for that body of evidence. If you take what I mean, I think the teaching profession, which sometimes goes and in follow of what the teacher training institutes are doing, they're also not necessarily aware of just how compelling that evidence and that body of knowledge is.
And that's a lot of my reporting has been centered around this very idea, right? That a lot of cognitive scientists or psychologists or researchers know some of this information, and teachers don't know it. And so when I bring up these two kinds of teaching, so people will often say, a lot of times on Twitter or wherever we're having these discussions, well, most teachers use both kinds of instruction. So is that true?
So my quick answer to this one is that in a true sense of inquiry approaches, you can't really use both of these together in a haphazard way. The reason being is in an inquiry-based approach, you're essentially saying that withholding instruction is the goal, because you're wanting students to come to the table themselves and to figure it out and to, they're saying things like productively struggle. You're wanting them to actually experience struggle in order to find the learning. Because, I've had debates on Twitter myself with people who said that if you give them the answer, you're stealing away their opportunity to come up with their understanding themselves. So fundamentally, if you hold that as the theory of learning, and that you can't interfere with students' independent problem solving, for example, then you can't really just sprinkle in a little bit of explicit instruction in there. It's going to be too late. It's going to be too little. It's going to be too unsystematic. It's not going to be sequential enough, because in order for learning to really happen in an appropriate and effective way, according to explicit instruction, you actually need to flip that completely and not feel bad about providing explanation and modeling as the first point of call.
Okay, so, and a lot of times, explanations I hear are things like, well, I learned to cook by exploring and trying different ingredients, and children should have that same opportunity, right, to explore all these different ingredients and try different approaches, and that there's a misunderstanding about how that is better learning, or like you learn more that way. So
more authentic
exactly. Yeah. So could you explain a little bit about why that authentic approach doesn't work with academic subjects like math?
So there is some insights from the cognitive science research, particularly cognitive load theory and evolutionary biology, which shows that the bodies of knowledge we're seeking students to have as a result of their teaching and their experiences in school, like English, like mathematics, like reading and writing, like scientific knowledge, for example, these bodies of knowledge are relatively recently part of the human experience in evolutionary terms. So as a result, we don't have cognitive mechanisms and very easily created pathways that just form through exposure to mathematics or exposure to reading and writing. In fact, it's only been around for about 5,000 years, reading and writing and mathematics around that sort of time as well, and only for the elite. So we don't have a reading brain or a mathematics brain, for example. We've got some threshold foundational sort of neuronal circuits, if you like, but we essentially need to take hold of those and repurpose them for the purpose of this kind of learning. So just watching someone else do it, or just being given the tools and sort of having a play doesn't bode well for having a system that is both equitable and efficient and effective. The reason being is it just takes too long for students to discover these approaches, and it's too much risk, essentially, that some students will never discover these approaches themselves. So no matter how many rich tasks they do and how many fantastic sort of games and explorations of mathematics that they can do, some students will just never learn the fundamentals, or have really big misconceptions about number and about size or about shape and location, things that we could easily just explain and set the foundations for early. If we roll the dice and say, well, some will get it, some won't, it essentially creates a really inequitable sort of situation. So it's not to say that there's no one achieving great mathematics skills under these approaches. I think inquiry-based approaches do produce mathematicians, and does produce some students who love maths. But unfortunately, it doesn't bode well for the majority, and it doesn't bode well for those who are historically marginalised as well, who might not have all of the protective factors, such as a parent who's noticing a difficulty with mathematics and therefore gets a tutor, which will compensate for any of those inquiry-based approaches with more explicit approaches, ironically. So if your child's not doing well, you're always going to go back to explicit approaches with a tutor, for example. Why would you get them to problem solve and discovery learn their way through a tutoring session when it's costing you an arm and a leg each week?
Right. And I mean, that's one of the things that has come up in my reporting several times, is that when you go to get tutoring or personalized, like help, if you're not doing well, you always get explicit instruction.
That's right. And just to add to that, I guess just so that people aren't walking away with a misapprehension here, I do think that you can use those really fun and those applied aspects of inquiry, sort of mathematics, for example, later in the learning sequence. You can use the knowledge and the skills that you're building with students systematically through that practice and feedback and modelling, and apply those to real life problems and real life scenarios, and doing lots of problem solving and things like that. But those should be done with the foundations really, really well taken care of, and be used as an application rather than a method for initial teaching. I think that's the real important message there.
And so then to put that in like everyday parent terms, once students get some of these skills under their belt, they understand multiplication and division and stuff, then you can give them these more open-ended, fun tasks.
Definitely.
Because they have kind of like the skills to do them.
Exactly, and that's where we want to get to. It's just the end point for both of these approaches is the same. We want students to have rich understandings of mathematics and its applications to everyday life, to think creatively and critically about the numbers and things around them, but we can't get there just by giving them lots of creative and critical sort of opportunities to think about maths in a different way. We actually need to teach them first and then facilitate those applications later.
So much of what you are saying is counterintuitive, I think, to how a lot of us who aren't researchers and, how we think about learning. So I feel like this is so important. So the last question I have is, why is there so much disagreement over what to use? So could you talk just a little bit about the decades-long argument over the two kinds of instruction and why this is still going on?
Well, it's to do with the big movements within what great teaching is, what learning involves, and even debates around what education is for. There are some educational researchers out there that say that education is not really about learning. It should be about social good, and it should be about social transformation. So the focus on learning and achievement is actually counterproductive, which is just so antithetical to what I believe, given the power of learning for all of the benefits that offers. But essentially these debates are really live issues. So saying that teaching is teaching about the teacher explaining and modelling, or is it about them facilitating and stepping it back, like the guide on the side, versus what is sort of critiqued as being a sage on the stage, for example, where they're just lecturing students. So these issues are live in universities, and they're live in teacher professions as well, and professional bodies, where good teaching is essentially something that's hotly debated and hotly contested. In the reading space, which is really obvious, they've got the reading wars, for example. The maths wars never seem to catch on as much. They don't get as much attention, but that sort of debate around what good teaching is still really live and happening, mainly because there are these competing and conflicting views of what good learning is. Some people say, well, learning is the students independently finding it for themselves. It's them exploring and explaining things off their own bat. It's applications to real life. It's deep learning. And then there's other competing views that say, well, learning needs to involve these foundations, and it needs to involve ensuring that students have them down pat so that they can make progress and so they don't get left behind, and not have many of our students at the moment, a huge proportion, without basics in mathematics and reading and writing, for example. So I think that there is much disagreement, mainly because we actually disagree on some of these fundamentals about what good teaching and what education is even for.
Great. And I mean, it seems to me that in the last few decades, that we have more research too. We just are gaining all the time, like more clues and more clues. Obviously, nothing is decided, nothing is set in stone, but that in the last few decades, we've got some more clues as to like how to guide teachers to
Definitely. And I think some of the emerging sort of anecdotal research and some of the case studies that I draw upon in my book, for example, really just goes to show that when you take some of these fundamental ideas from the science of learning and from the cognitive sciences, you can actually see the impact that it has, not just on the students who had historically struggled and had difficulty with maths and English, but actually for all students, like raising the bar in terms of excellence, but also raising it in terms of equity. And so the case studies that I feature in my book, which are just mind-blowingly captivating in my humble opinion, the reason I wrote this book is because of how good they were as pre and post sort of examples, is you've gone from schools that are just fine or schools that are really, really in dire straits to then becoming schools that are exemplary and, the top in the state, or have the most number of students performing above the average in any of the local areas, or students that in a school that it's relatively disadvantaged actually achieving where they need to on benchmark and feeling really successful and really adding a lot of value given the disadvantage of the area. So when you apply these principles in mathematics, but also in other areas, the outcomes for equity and the outcomes for excellence are incredible. We're yet to see the controlled studies that prove this definitively, but all of the evidence from the sources that we've talked about today and from these case studies that we've got that are happening right now point to the importance of these approaches and the wins in terms of student learning and teacher well-being as well.
That's great. And I mean, we're going to add a lot of these resources. Dr. Swain is going to share with us some links to some studies and to some articles to help us better understand it. But I understand explicit instruction and inquiry instruction better now. So, and I hope everyone else out there does too. So thank you so much to Dr. Nathaniel Swain for being here. This has helped a lot to help clarify it. We're going to have a list of resources in the post below this video, including the research that we talked about. And I want to mention one more thing, and that is you have a Substack, and it's just your name, right? Like Dr. Nathaniel Swain.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's really good, and it breaks down some of these
that's very kind.
issues of instruction and learning down, and it's easy to read, and it's really good. So check that out as well. I'll have a link to your Substack in this post as well. But thanks for being here, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This was really helpful.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks. Okay, bye-bye.